is going to be dealing with, but do most scientists understand what science is? And what does this have to do with the perceived conflict between biblical religion and science?
Yeah, so I think that we touched on some of that already in the, well, so I'll start again. I think that when you are taught to do science well, there's a lot that you can be taught that's about making you good at playing the game according to certain rules, but not understanding the prior position outside of science that would be one where you could talk about how those rules are being chosen. So you go and I mean, first, it's even more serious than that, because there's so much knowledge science has generated now that you could spend all your time just learning about things that scientists have discovered and that they generally agree upon now. And you can be very knowledgeable and very skilled in certain ways, but it's like you're in this walled garden where you can be very effective, but you don't have like the bird's eye view of it. So you can learn about protons and electrons and neutrons, and you can learn about DNA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's all these different things that you can develop a deeper understanding of theoretically. You know, you can do experiments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can be taught even methodology of science, where it's like, okay, you know, you want to be able to generate experimental results that are reproducible, where you can share your methods with someone and tell them to them, and then they can do the same set of observations, and they'll get the same results, and et cetera. It's like all the intellectual components of that and being taught the scientific method. I think that a majority, even of very good scientists, don't in practice have to think very much about whether there are things about the world that are true that are not just difficult to access with the scientific method, but might by definition be inaccessible to the scientific method, right? Like, and you can actually, it's not very hard to think of fairly trivial examples of this, like science strains towards the ideal of objectivity. It's about things that you and I both have access to. So we can measure things out in the world, like the temperature outside, and we can look at the same thermometer or two thermometers made according to the same methods, and we can agree that the numbers that they're showing, you know, agree within certain bounds, whatever. And then we can base our discussion, the social process of science, because really you can't do science by yourself. We can base that on those things that we share. Speaking in Wittgensteinian terms, it's a language game that has, you know, certain conventions, right? If I talk about my subjective experience, there are things that I experience that no one else has access to. And it might be the case that you could observe things about me or measure things about me that correspond in general to my reporting that I'm having certain subjective experiences. So you can scientifically study the external and objectifiable things about me that seem to happen when I say that I'm feeling pain, or when I, you know, see the color red or whatever. But that is not the same thing as studying my subjective experience, and it never will be. By definition, it can't be. You cannot do science on subjective experience, because science defines itself as straining towards that which can be made objective. And so what does that mean? Does that mean that my subjective experience is not part of anything that's true about the world? Like, period? We're just done. We discard it. It's an illusion. It's not as simple as that, right? Like, it's legitimate to pose the question whether subjective experiences are part of what can be true about the world without there being scientizably true. And so I think already we're talking about like 5% of scientists who bother to ever think about that. Even ones who are very good at their job. They might be brilliant theoretical physicists. They might be, you know, Nobel Prize winning biologists or whatever, where they learn the rules of a game within certain boundaries. They've played it very well. They know how to do that. They know how to discover a new protein and figure out what it does. They know how to propose a new mathematical term in the standard model that will, you know, tell you about the physics of some particle that interacts with a Higgs boson or whatever. but they just have never lifted their eyes to that kind of question about what science is doing, because they're not encouraged to mostly when they're taught how to be scientists. And I think that observation about scientists culturally is a huge part of the explanation for how scientists can be so smart and so good at what they're doing, and yet also be mostly, as a group, very closed-minded and very childish in their understanding of what, for example, Torah might have to teach about the world. And I don't mean like, oh, if they just like sit down and think a little bit more about it, they realize that Torah is the only answer and it's obvious, or something like that. It's a longer discussion. But I think that their acculturation in a view of the ability of science to reveal things that are true about the world as like the sole method for doing that isn't necessary for doing science well. In fact, it can sometimes prevent you from doing science well. But it is a common cultural trope. Like, they're taught to relate to what they're doing as though they're walking around turning over rocks and discovering different things that are true about the world that were always true, but which just needed to be found out. Whereas in fact, they are much more so engaging in a social process where they talk to each other about what seems to be objectively predictable about the world, and trying to make up together stories about how to codify that predictability in ways to see new implications of it. And that latter characterization, I think, is the way of understanding what science is that fits into a broader worldview that's founded on Torah. And I think it actually is even if we weren't talking about Torah, I think many philosophers of scientists would admit that's a more accurate characterization of what science is. But most scientists don't bother to think about that, and they're even actively educated by the scientists who teach them about science to take a less coherent and more arrogant view of what it is that they're doing.
Thank you. And should